Okay, hi everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Avishay. I work for Microsoft, and I'm also the co-chair of the Best Practices Working Group at the Open Source Security Foundation. So, why am I here, right? I'm here basically because I believe that a multidisciplinary approach to security is the way forward, right? Because if we keep security to the B-sides, if we keep security to the black hats, right, we're just preaching to the choir. However, if we all work together and we have a reason to work together, then I think that that is much a better future for us all. So what brings me to this optimistic assumption? Let's do a quick test here, right? So, with a raise of hands, can I see any maintainers of an open or an inner source project, right? So you are part of the core team, DevOps team, development team. Okay, quite a few people are maintainers here. Thank you, right? Thank you for your great software. Thank you very much. Contributors. So you contributed to an open or an inner source project. You opened an issue. You wrote some documentation. Raise of hands? Okay, a bit more people. Makes sense, right? Last question, I promise. Any consumers of open or inner source projects, right? Okay, so obviously everyone already raised their hands at least once, and typically more than once, right? Because that's just the nature of the software supply chain, right, that we are all part of. And you can think of it as a loop, right? We produce code, so contributors and maintainers produce a lot of code, and that is being consumed on the right-hand side by the downstream consumers or the users. And that feeds back the process. And of course, you know, it's not a linear chain like we see here, right? It's not as simplistic as this, because a real application won't have just one dependency, right? Typically, it will have like 5, 10, 15 different dependencies, right? And that's just one layer down, right? If we drill to the transitive dependencies, then we get 25, right? Because each one of those had 5 of their own dependency. And you can see that this tree gets damn thick, damn fast, right? And by the time it gets to the user, that also has to also sees the dependencies of the operating system, of the cloud infrastructure, of the client technology that they are using, then of course the complexity is great. And moreover, it raises really interesting questions about trust and about security. And in the end, right, if there is a breach, if there is an exploit of a vulnerability within any of the chain that we saw, right, it doesn't really matter to the user. But who pays the highest price? Who stands to pay the highest price if a breach is taking place? It's obviously the user, right? And here you can see the user really wanting to be the user of a different service, right? Not your service, but some other service that didn't go through that breach. And obviously, we don't want that, right? So that brings me back to my original question, why do we care, right? Why DevOps, why software engineers, data scientists, TPMs need to care about security? It's because we love our users, right? And we want our users to keep loving our wonderful software. So what it boils down to is we should care about security because we care about our downstream consumers and about our users. And you know, those users, they have expectations, right? It's funny that way. They expect that the software that they are using is adequately secure. Okay, let's give it the minimum. Oh, and they expect that the data is private. Okay? And those expectations can also be enforced, right, by governments, by courts, by regulators. Of course, we all know about Cyber Resilience Act, AI Act, US executive orders. All of those are ways to enforce those expectations on us, right, the software providers. And that's because a breach causes harm, right? It harms the software users, it harms our organizations, and we don't want that. We don't want that because That has cost. And cost has implications on our jobs, right? It's not even that we can turn a blind eye, right, on these threat vectors, on this question of trust and security that I raised earlier, right? Because the numbers, if we look at the numbers of exploitations of this software supply chain, are increasing, right? So we can take 2024, we saw the same number as 2023 backwards, right? The sum of. And you know what? That was exactly my line in 2024, and it was my line in 2023. And so the problem is still there. So those are like your xzutils attack, right? Or the log4shell or log4j, which everyone heard about, right? So these are the numbers that we see here. And you know, it's not just numbers. It's also the sheer sophistication of those attacks, right? So here, for instance, we see the time of the xzutil attack, right? So you can see that the threat actor, presumably nation-state actor, that started planning the attack 2 years before it actually became exploitable. More than that, they noticed at some point that the final pull request that they would suggest to insert the malicious code would be detected by one of the CI/CD tools that runs a dynamic application security testing, right? OSS in this case. So again, presumably, they disabled this check at the source. And only then they could merge the final PR and be able to exploit that attack. Right, so the sophistication here is very, very impressive. And you know, for me, I work for Microsoft for a very special team. We love acronyms at Microsoft. I don't know if you know, everything is 3-letter acronyms. So my team is called Industry Solutions Engineering, or ISE, and we engage with hyperscale customers for engineering customer success, you can say, right? So we co-engineer together with our customers, and obviously those customers, the biggest pharma, the biggest banking organizations, they care about this, right? They worry about that. So we started asking ourselves, as an org, how can we improve, right? How can we bring safer, how can we build safer software with our customers? So one of the first tools, and by the way, much of the work that we do is in open source, right? So we were looking for solutions that are open source and that address the open source supply chain security issues. So one of the first tools that we started using is Scorecard. Raise of hands, anyone heard using Scorecard? Okay, some hands, cool. What is Scorecard? So Scorecard is first and foremost an evaluation tool, right? It works on the repository level, and it's great for evaluating threats that are around, for instance, malicious maintainers, malicious packages, compromises to the source code or to the build system. And the way that it works, right, is that it analyzes the actual repository, so your settings on GitLab or GitHub or GitHub Enterprise or ADO, sorry, 3-letter acronyms, Azure DevOps. And it runs a set of 18 checks, which are built in. There are more checks, which are extension of those, but those are heuristics, right? So they address different types of security of threats in the open source security in the open source supply chain. Each one of those heuristics has a risk level associated to it, right? So you can think about branch protection, pretty risky, versus having CI tests, medium to low risk, right? And once we weigh all of those different heuristics together, we get a score of 1 to 10, which gives us a pretty good feel to the security awareness of the project. No more, no less, okay? And I'm saying this on purpose. Some use cases for Scorecard. So first, as an individual maintainer, when we work with our customers, one of the first things that we would do before we open source a project is run scorecard to get a checklist, right, of things that we can improve. For instance, the branch protection can be improved. For instance, you don't have static code analysis, right? You're not using CodeQL. Second use case is for an organization. So here, we're leveraging the scorecard action to run it on all of our repositories, right, under our organization, to keep an acceptable minimal value. Here, by the way, you can see a snapshot from the Microsoft Open Source Program Office, right? So those are the folks who are responsible for all of Microsoft organizations in GitHub. And we get, as you can see here on the far right, a score, also a historic score, and also a breakdown of those different heuristics over time for each one of our open source projects. Now, it's important to note, we don't require a minimal value, right? But even surfacing this in an easily digestible way for our developers helps, right? And the last part is for consumers, right? So here we are planning to consume a new dependency. So we run scorecard to see if, again, to get a feel for the security awareness of the project. Now, I know you're probably already thinking, you know, I can put this on my build and break my build if a new dependency is added and it has a score lower than X. That's a bit more tricky because a lower score doesn't necessarily mean that it's not secure. A high score does mean that it is. So breaking a build on top of that is a bit tricky. That's at least our experience. And you can also leverage the open data that scorecard has of the project that run the scorecard action. For instance, here, we can see it in depths.dev, that you can go and see any PyPI, Node.js, NuGet package, and see the breakdown of that score. Okay, so scorecard is really great, and it's really, really been a game changer to my team. But let's ask ourselves in this SDLC, which part of the data flow diagram, so to speak, do we fix here? So that one. Right, so scorecard helps us to analyze and mitigate some of the threats that when choosing a dependency to take into our project. However, obviously, the threat model, the full threat model of the SDL, of the software development lifecycle, should take into consideration all trust boundaries crossing, right? So for instance, if we have a trust boundary before when the developer pushes their code to the source control management system, that's one trust boundary to handle. There's another trust boundary here, right? When the consumers, either the next development team or the end user gets the published software, that's another trust boundary. Now, depending on your software development lifecycle architecture, right, if it's an enterprise or you are fully cloud, there might be more trust boundaries here, right? And that depends if your, for instance, your build system and your packaging system are in the same network, right? If they are, then it's not a trust boundary, and if they're not, then it is. So the question is, how can we tackle all of these threats? And that's exactly where the Open Source Security Foundation comes into play, right? So the Open Source Security Foundation, I'm sorry for putting a very, very worn out image from the internet on my presentation, but I think it hits the nail on the head, right? Because every organization today leverages a lot of open source, right? And we don't really know if we can trust the open source that we consume. Typically we can, but sometimes we can't. And it's not just a Microsoft problem, right? Obviously, it's a shared problem by the industry, and that's why all of those organizations are backing up the Open Source Security Foundation, and the working groups have active participations by all of those organizations. And those organizations are really trying to tackle all of the threats across the software development lifecycle, right? So you can take things from the best practices working group, for instance, the scorecard that I just talked about. You can take the vulnerability disclosure working group, which works on the vulnerability information. For instance, if anyone heard about VEX or vulnerability exploitability, SBOM tooling under the supply chain integrity, and Alpha Omega, which takes the critical open source projects and works with them to improve their security. So key projects, SigStore, I think a very well-known name. Its marketing is that we want to become to digital signature what Let's Encrypt is to HTTPS, and I think they are making a very, very good way at that. Salsa, which enables us to make decisions about what kind of dependencies we want to take and trust in our software supply chain. GWAC, which turns SBOMs, or software bill of materials, into actionable graph. And the open source project security baseline, which enables interoperable resource for identification of security data. But of course, you know, it's not enough, just tools, right? DevOps is more than tools, right? And that's why, if we look at the SDLC, on the far left, and that's part of my passion, is about education, right? It's about reaching out, it's about learning. And some of the content that the best practices working group keeps on updating are the guides. And you can find more guides here, but I will note, for instance, the concise guide for developing more secure software, or the concise guide for evaluating open source software. The source code management platform configuration best practices was contributed by Legit Software, which is a cybersecurity startup. And we are currently working on security-focused guide for AI code assistant development. So vibe coding securely. Okay. If you want to take it one step forward, you can take our courses. So those courses are free, and they give you cool LinkedIn badges. For instance, the new Cyber Resilience Act for developers. So it has just enough legal, so even I could understand it. And it's a great intro into this world that's coming on top for all of us. And I would definitely invite managers to take this security for software developer managers, or for or the developing secure software course. So that's almost it for me. I hope that I provided you with some actionable insights. I do invite you to join our calls. I think you would find it a very inclusive experience, and one that can actually make a lot of impact on this industry that we are on. I can assure you that 3 years ago, I wouldn't have dreamt to be in DevOps Amsterdam, at DevOps Days Amsterdam, talking about security as a Linux Foundation member. And the open source world, kind of like in the talk that Virginia had just before me, I hope you caught that, was a step forward in my career. So those are some more ways to catch us online, and feel free to connect with me, and I'll be happy to continue the discussion. Thank you. Any questions?